tuned is a complete revolution compared to what you had before. You can now put your music in front of people worldwide, and you can get data on where that music is being consumed. So it gives you the ability to better plan for touring, for promotional, for promotions and similar. You do have to be careful that streaming isn't everything, and certainly the royalty rates that we see from streaming may be a concern to a number of musicians.
Right. There is, though, at least from the managers or the booking agent's perspective, proof of demand, or at least proof of early acceptance into a market when thinking about routing a tour. And I know that data has certainly been acted on for many UK and US-based artists who have never been to South America before.
Absolutely, it provides a lot of value, but you also have to think about the difficulties of moving into a different culture. We talk about the opportunities in a place like China at the moment, but simply breaking into a market like China requires very detailed planning. How do you appeal to people in China? And it's often simply a matter of being there physically, of trying to tour, trying to get on one of the TV talent shows that are hugely popular there. So the potential is there, but the potential is difficult to exploit sometimes simply by not being in that country in the first place.
I wanted to clarify something that I was wondering about, and I think that some of you might have been a little bit confused about. That was in David's presentation. I think Josh mentioned performance rights also, and I believe that what you were both talking about was public performance in the sound recording, not in the musical composition, but just the aspect of public performance as it relates to the sound recording itself. So when you're looking at market data across countries and territories and public performance income, that is indeed what you're tracking, right? Just to clarify?
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, for the United States, we're only talking about digital performance rates.
Right. The conversation that we'll maybe touch on later this afternoon. Bonnie, a question for you. Considering the conversation that we heard yesterday morning about diversity and inclusion and Me Too and the differentials that exist in the data in compensation for female musicians, the data that you showed was a little bit different. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it is surprising. Among our 11 artist occupations, there are only a few in which women have approached that level of parity. The other one, interesting, is producers and directors. But I do think the important caveat is that we're looking at musicians that are working full year, full time. So that's kind of a select group among musicians. And I have to wonder if they aren't more likely to be represented by a union, or certainly on a regular job, with the symphony orchestra, working for Broadway, what have you. So I'm just wondering if that's factoring into this level of parity that we're seeing. But yes, also when we looked at the American Community Survey from 2005 through 9, these two American Community Surveys, which I'm not sure if everyone knows that it's a rolling sample. So if you want to compare results, you have to make sure they don't touch in years. But that the 05, 09 ACS showed the same type of parity back then among women musicians.
I have a question for Josh, and then we'll go to your questions. Josh, as we're getting ready for this panel, one of the things that we talked about that didn't come up in the presentation was the relationship between radio and streaming. It's interesting. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so certainly from the consumer side, there's been a tremendous change in the last 10 years. The data I presented is what's collected by the RIA directly, but we do a lot of consumer research as well. And one of the things that we've seen is, especially for discovery, while radio remains probably across the board the broadest consumption medium, 90+% of people listen to radio. The distance between radio and streaming and other digital formats has narrowed quite a bit. So it used to be radio, and then everything else was much, much lower. And we've seen streaming just completely open up and has crept up so much in terms of discovery and as a source that we're starting to see for the first time that some groups, so if you look at, say, consumers under 25, for some of those groups, streaming has already surpassed radio.
Right. And yet, I'm somebody who also studies radio. I'm struck and was struck last fall when we noted in some of our work that for radio's youngest listeners, the numbers are, unassailable. That so much time spent listening is being spent on streaming platforms, and yet the radio industry, in their response, was claiming, absolutely rock solid listening in their youngest demographics. And I think that it strained credibility for them to make that statement, given what we know about streaming and what young people are actually doing.
I think we've started to see it come up in the data. When you look at the aggregate numbers for streaming, Bridge Ratings has a lot of data on this, and we've started to see radio just starting to come down off the peak. So I think it is starting to happen.
Okay. What questions do you have? Let's hear from you. Alan.
I have one question for David and one for Josh. You mentioned the gap between the wholesale and retail revenue in the U.S. was $509 billion, it was $8.5 billion. I'm surprised it was that large, even on streaming, I would think. I can see through the old-fashioned stores if there was a markup of 25, 30%, maybe more. But can you explain why the gap is 20%?
Yeah, actually, I think part of the reason is that, unfortunately, we really don't have retail values for some of these newer formats. So if we think about performance rights, if we think about the ad-supported streaming services, there simply is no retail equivalent. So in our case, we're just using the wholesale number as the retail number. And I think that is what's narrowing the gap. If we look at the more traditional pieces, for example, we could talk about subscription services because they've generally publicly said that they're paying out about 70% of their revenue to music creators. So that's why there's that gap.
And Josh, do you have, you said you're getting data from your members, and then you've got to impute the rest from other sources. What fraction are you imputing? Do you think there might be some account?
Well, we go to great lengths to make sure that we are doing this correctly. I have a terrific associate named Matt, and putting together these numbers and handling all the details around it is pretty much the majority of his job. So one of the things we do is we take all of the data on a format-by-format basis, and we use these external sources to see which labels have we already collected data from and which labels have we not collected data from, and make the estimates. And what we find generally is that the data that we're collecting directly is generally 80 to 85% of the market, and there's some variance by format.
I don't know, David, I don't know if you want to respond.
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Josh says, we do very much the same thing, just worldwide. We work with our member companies to get data from them. We work with a few indie organizations. We work very closely with our national groups and with the member companies in particular countries to generate what we call a coverage rate. How far are our figures, our revenue figures, representative of the entire market? And we have different methods of working that out in different countries. We're often looking at charts. We're getting data from DSPs, for instance, like Spotify, to be able to calculate how much of the total consumption is represented by the revenue figures that we get. And it is, Josh was talking about it being Matt's full-time job. We have a staff of 5 or 6 in our sales and reporting team, and it is a very large part of their work as well.
Did you have a follow-up, Alan? Did you have another question? Let's go over here and then over to Joel.
Okay. Andy Moravchik from Princeton. This question to Bonnie. So as somebody who studies classical music, I think the only person here who studies classical music, I know that it's about 1% of recorded music sales. So I was quite surprised to see that it's 40% of live music sales according to your data. So what explains that? Is that really true? Is it leaving something out, or is it really true that 40% of live music is classical?
Those are the estimates from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And again, that's at a commodity level. It could be performed by a symphony orchestra. It could be presented by any type of other performing arts organization. So it's a commodity, not an industry. So I don't know if that helps. The commodities in the account are far more detailed than the industry. So the industry is the performing arts industry, but the commodity is more detailed. So performances by symphonies, chamber groups, other types of music performances.
Joel?
Thanks. I heard all the thoughts. I have a question for Bonnie. So I was really interested in the NEA interest in quantifying value of the arts. It seems like a very labor market focused approach as opposed to a product market focused approach. And I wonder if there's any sympathy or interest in NEA in thinking about a more product market focused approach, which is not to say how much are we spending, but rather what are we getting? How much, what's the volume, and in some sense, the quality of the new material we bring? Would that be something of interest to the NEA?
Certainly sounds interesting. I'm not sure how we can measure quality. Of course, that would be pursued through the NEA Research Grants Program, right?
I've been trying to convince WIPO and other organizations to set up observatories. And so it requires a fair bit of effort to get data and so forth. So it's not just a one-off project. I mean, if somebody really wants to see how are we doing, there's a lot of work that's required. I just wonder if anybody has any.
I know there were some other hands. Yes, Gigi.
I have two questions. One of them is that Bonnie showed some interesting data on import-export, which I don't tend to think of that in terms of concerts. I actually tend to think of it in terms of recorded music. And there was some data in the other data. Can you guys talk a bit more about what's happening on sort of import-export trends, both internationally and domestically, with such a globally facing marketplace?
You know, one thing, as part of the work that we did with that economist, he has, this is Professor, he's a consultant, not a professor, I'm sorry. But Sawek did a report on the broader copyright industries in the U.S. economy and music as well as other creative forms. I think movies were the biggest, were actually among the biggest exports of the United States, and that was compared to all other industries, not just compared to media industries. Unfortunately, I don't recall if there was a significant trend change in recent years.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that arts and culture, the trade surplus is growing every year. It's widening and widening and widening. And for our exports that are contributing to the surplus, it is movies and TV shows that's driving that. It's odd because the most popular arts and cultural import is manufactured jewelry. And our second import are movies and TV shows. And if you look at the exports, the big export is movies and TV shows, and the second, jewelry. It suggests that we here in the United States and everyone else in the world, we all love movies, TV shows, and jewelry.
Sounds like an understanding. Now, so the second thing I was going to ask is, we've been showing growth, and part of we've been showing growth coming from subscription revenue, which we've been talking about a couple times, is kind of a fixed pool we're then sharing. Where do you guys see trend-wise next 5 years the areas of growth? Getting non-listeners to be paying, transferring from iTunes, Dead Body over into other parts of the business, increase in China with Tencent, but where are we seeing the growth projections?
I think streaming certainly has space to grow even further. If you look at, as I said, you look at Sweden and Norway, which were first on the road to streaming. We're still seeing growth there. We're still seeing more people adopting streaming services. And I think there's still a lot of space in most markets for more people to take those subscription services. And I think there's still, as I said, growth for other types of product. We're seeing companies licensed to other types of services, fitness services, ways in which, once you have 45 million tracks that are being added to every week, there is a massive amount of music for people to play around with and innovate with. I think the other area of growth is simply those economies where we see space for further potential. In China and India, obviously, but then you look at someone like Indonesia, A country of 230 million. You look at Russia, 130 million people. These are countries where you look at their relative GDP, you look at the amount they're spending on music. There's huge space there, and streaming is a very, very good way of introducing people to the value of music and encouraging them to think more about what it means to them. Once you put it in people's pocket, on their phone, and give them access to everything, it becomes a very different value proposition to buying, shelling out for a single CD or a single piece of vinyl.
I would add for the U.S., and keep in mind the caveat that all predictions are wrong or your money back. We've seen the strongest growth when companies have come in and started up new services. So we've had Apple basically join the market in 2016, in the middle of 2015, and then really took off in 2016. We've not seen a slowdown in terms of companies coming into this space. Since Apple came to that space, we've now seen Amazon with a very strong rollout, and it seems like once a month you'll see some tech company says we're going to start a subscription service, and now Pandora has an unlimited service. So we've had a rising tide lifting all the boats as more and more people get involved. I think the publicity spreads, more and more people find out about it. And while 35 million paid subscriptions is fantastic, that's still relatively small compared to how many potential big music fans there are in the United States.
I think that's a really good point. We've reached a point where we're now starting to see more and more investment in the music space. Spotify IPO'd, Goldman Sachs are issuing reports, other investment banks are issuing future potential reports about what's going on. There are people looking for ways to get into this market, whether it's streaming services or it's hardware or it's software or it's different ways of using all of that music. There is a huge amount of interest in where the future potential is, where the future profit is. So we're stoked. For the next few years, there will be a huge amount of growth, and it's a very exciting space to be in at the moment.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Let's thank Josh. Thank you for listening. I see there were